Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carsten Booth. I'm a pedagogical quality advisor for CLL's Kids and Teens department. And today I will be giving a webinar on what if teaching kids and teens online could be even more efficient than in person. I started noticing a couple of very interesting effects that were different than the in-person teaching environment. And that's what I'm going to discuss today. And one of the main things that I noticed was a sense of flow, both for learners and for teachers. I noticed that for perhaps not long periods of time, but for short, intense periods, there were experiences of flow, by which to say learners were completely immersed in what they were doing, and there were high degrees of concentration and deliberate practice. I thought this was really interesting as well, because it would yield very often quite impressive results, very quick ascendancy, very quick language acquisition paths for learners, things that I wouldn't typically associate with online learning, because after all, we're just staring at a computer screen. You wouldn't expect that much language acquisition to occur within a short period of time. Now, I will say that this was under specific conditions, but this high degree of concentration and good results were surprising. And I experienced it as a teacher as well. Very often I would come out of online sessions having no idea of how much time I'd spend in the online class. I was so concentrated. And this gave me pause for reflection. And a couple of questions came up. And number one, how did this come about? After all, like I said, we're staring at a computer screen, learners and teachers alike. How were we able to get into this deep level of concentration and focus and produce great results? Also, what kind of conditions led to these results? Because it was certainly not everyone's experience. There were teachers that didn't have this experience, or learners that didn't have this experience at all. But what conditions contributed to really dynamic learning experiences online? And then if we could identify these conditions, could we potentially recreate that with other teachers and learners? These are the questions that I've been meditating, musing over, and throughout since 2017, I've come to a couple of conclusions, best practices that really allow us to attain high levels of efficiency in online learning, and that's what we'll be looking at today. But you might say to yourself, "Okay, Carsten, sounds good, but why focus on online learning now? Is it really the priority? Is that really important?" After all, a lot of people have gone back to brick and mortar education, especially kids and teens that are in school or in universities, higher level learning establishments. Is it really important to focus on the virtual learning environment? And I would argue that yes, absolutely, because if you look at the trends, yes, we're no longer, thankfully, no longer in the period of the pandemic, but numbers have gone up for online learning. The amount of people pursuing online degrees is at a record massive high, and it's only projected to increase in the future. Moreover, two new trends in technology will completely revolutionize this industry within the next 5 or 10 years, by which I mean to say virtual reality, VR, and augmented reality, AR. Both of these developments are not that far away. There are nascent forms of these technologies which are already being used, but the more advanced forms that will come out in the future might really open up a lot of opportunities for us. Imagine showing up in your living room, putting on a pair of glasses, and seeing around your dining room table your class of students. This is not that far off. It's not science fiction. It is being planned and worked on for the moment. So I would argue that learning the best practices in online teaching is more imperative now than at any other time. That if we can get that down, that new forms of technology will be easier to pick up and master. You also might say, well, why focus on efficiency? After all, I'm a teacher. Does that mean I need to work harder, produce more results, teach more students? And in this context, I mean efficiency to focus on deliberate practice. That is to say, the state in which we obtain language acquisition the most efficiently. That is to say, effortful practice focused on specific language items in which we get feedback on a very regular, systematic, or direct basis. This produces efficiency in language acquisition and means that we can climb up the CFR much more quickly than if we're just passively getting information. You also might say, why kids and teens? Why focus on kids and teens? After all, this is the demographic that has most gone back to brick and mortar education. Like I said, schools, higher level institutions, high schools, universities. And I would say, well, there are several reasons. Number one, that it's true, a lot of instruction has gone back to physical classrooms, but number one, kids or teens are the future. They will be in our virtual learning environments more and more as they grow up, but also on a more simple level, they have the lowest tolerance for ambiguity or lack of clarity in instruction. And in this sense, they are a great litmus test for basic principles. If we can succeed an online course with kids and teens, our most demanding teaching audience, everything else can be much easier. And we can scale up for higher levels, different forms of objectives, different teaching audiences. They are the foundation, the bedrock of education, if you will. So that's why I really have chosen to focus on kids and teens. Moreover, it's simply a pleasure teaching them. And this online teaching environment expands our capacity to connect with many more learners than in the past. So that being said, our objectives for this webinar today. At the end of this webinar, hopefully you'll be able to identify the hidden phenomena that govern online teaching and learning for kids and teens. I say hidden, but it's hidden in plain sight, because what I'm really talking about is the specific capacity of this technology and the way it shifts our perception and thus learning aptitudes in a language learning context. Second objective will be to understand how online learning, given this hidden phenomena, can be even more efficient than in-person instruction for young learners. A contentious statement, perhaps, but I will intend to also demonstrate it with simple steps that you can put into practice in your own teaching, specifically with kids and teens, that might show how you can put this into practice. So in-person learning, I think it's important to note that with in-person learning, there are a couple of things that characterize it that are important, specifically spherical 3D perspective. This is really the hallmark of in-person learning, is that we can see everything around us in the physical classroom. I can turn my head 360 degrees and see 3D images of everything, learners, the teacher, the space that in which we're teaching, which is really, really nice because it's comfortable. And it's very different than in online learning, where what I see is rectangular and is flat screen 2D. Also, there are multiple sources of sound and multiple sources of sound that can coexist. That is to say, there are learners to the left of me, to the right of me, ahead of me, in front of me. There are exterior noises, interior noises. Also, these can coexist. Two people can have a chat to my left, two people can have a chat to my right without necessarily interrupting each other or making each other unintelligible. In online learning, as we'll see, this is very different because there's only one source of sound. Also, there's unfiltered audio. I'm hearing everything inside and outside of the room. And there is no filter on that at all. With online learning, obviously, we can only hear what goes through the microphone, through the computer, and that which is transmitted back to us. Also, there's a free range of movement, which is to say, I can get up, I can move throughout the physical space, and as long as I'm not hiding behind the whiteboard, everyone can see me. This is an important detail because it's not the same in online learning. We'll see that. And these crucial differences pop up in online learning is that, like I said, it's a rectangular 2D perspective. The only thing I can see when I'm learning online is this. Now, this is very reduced compared to this. My perception of what's happening, all of my peripheral vision is cut out. This has some interesting consequences to it. Of course, I could get closer to the screen and it might be this, but it's still a fraction of what I'm actually capable of seeing. This has important ramifications. Also, there's only one source of sound, like I said. I can only hear what's coming through my microphone and that of other participants in the online learning space. That means that only one person can really speak at one time and still be intelligible. Yes, there are breakout rooms, but even in a breakout room, turn taking is obligatory, especially for kids and teens. We cannot have simultaneous conversations and focus on both people and what they're saying. Impossible. Also, there's filtered audio, which is to say, I only hear what's coming through the microphone. I can't hear exterior noises. Also, almost everything sounds the same. Someone with a booming voice and someone with a very soft voice will have more or less the same volume. Digitized sounds cut out a lot of the timbre of one's voice as well. So there's really a compressed amount of sound that we can hear. This has, once again, important consequences. Lastly, there's a reduced range of movement, by which to mean I can only move within this space and have people still see me. Yes, I can move around my living room wherever I'm having the virtual class, but nobody's going to see me. Of course, I could take the computer with me and move with it, but I'm still constrained, restricted by this box, which is my webcam. This is important because it means that anything you want to show people, anything you want them intentionally to see, has to happen here. There's a reduced, restricted range of movement. So if we compare the two, in-person learning and online learning, many teachers prefer in-person teaching because it seems restrictive online. However, I think what these restrictions, and I'll put that in quotes, actually mean, can actually yield some very interesting, more efficient results for two specific reasons. Number one, something that I call the blinder effect. Anyone who's seen horses in a city will have seen them probably with blinders to cut out unuseful visual stimuli that might distract them from achieving their principal task, that is to say, transporting something or going somewhere, which means that a horse in a field its range of movement, everything that it might be able to do is very different than that of a horse in a carriage. But the horse in the carriage, thanks to these blinders, can perform very highly precise and impressive feats, such as leading a carriage at a high-speed trot or gallop on a narrow walkway. That is possible because of blinders. Now, you might say to yourself, Carsten, maybe we're not horses, we're human beings, but this can be seen also in online and in-person, specifically work spaces where, for example, open space floor seating means that there are a tremendous amount of distractions and are nowhere as conducive to deep forms of concentration as a home office, for example, or just an individual office. This is the blinder effect with human beings. That is to say, if we cut out unuseful forms of information, we're able to concentrate better. So very, very simple principle, but it is valid for online learning as well. We'll see why. There's also a second effect that's important in online learning called the whiteboard effect. This was coined by productivity guru Cal Newport, which says essentially that if there is a whiteboard, a physical medium by which we can denote progress by changing things on the whiteboard that draws everyone's attention in, we can enter into deeper states of concentration. Online learning, of course, is mostly whiteboard oriented or visually oriented. So we'll see how this comes into place. But these two different phenomena, both the blinder effect and the whiteboard effect, mean that online learning can very often yield higher degrees of efficiency. Let's explore these benefits. So yeah, indeed, in online learning, there's a rectangular 2D perspective, but that also means that there are also reduced visual distractions because I can't see what's happening around a physical classroom. If I'm a little child, I can't see who's playing with that toy, or I can't see somebody who's looking me in the eye. There are reduced visual distractions. My peripheral vision is not there. It also means that there's 100% visual learning. I can only see what's happening on the screen. So, for example, if I see this photo of this beautiful tiger, I can very much appreciate the exquisite detail of its fur, the colors, the texture, the look in its eye. More so, potentially more so than in a physical learning space where I might see it up on a whiteboard or on a screen, but it's further away. It's not as apparent. And it does not occupy my concentration quite as much as in a virtual learning space. And it's true, there is one source of sound in online learning. However, that also means that there are reduced auditive distractions and hence clear dialogue. Why do I say that? Is because I can't hear someone who's having a side conversation, because side conversations make everything unintelligible in online learning. There are less distractions. Also, I'm getting filtered sound, so I'm only hearing what's happening in my class. Also, dialogue gets clearer because only one person can speak at one time, and I have to focus in on that person. There's essentially more clarity in terms of what happens in class. Also, it's true that there's filtered audio, but instructions and feedback can get clearer. I can hear the speaker's voice better. I can hear what's happening in terms of different instructions. I can see them perhaps even clearer as well, above all what's happening on our virtual whiteboard. Lastly, there is a reduced range of motion. I can't move outside of this box. However, that also means that there are reduced physical distractions. We don't have children running across the room. There are no smart boards on the table that might be buzzing and distracting us. Also, movement becomes more intentional. If we're moving, if we're presenting something, it has to happen for a specific reason. Otherwise, it won't be remarkable in any way. So for these reasons, there are some serious benefits for both kids and teens. If there are less visual, auditive, physical, or external distractions, that means we can achieve greater levels of focus. Also, if instructions are clear and feedback is clarified as well, it might be and is, under the right circumstances, easier to follow. Also, if everything is made 100% visual, if all of our slides are filled with photos, if we use the whiteboard effect to cultivate this concentration by clearly denoting progress when people have to speak, there can be improved comprehension. This is really important, like I said, for kids and teens. They have the lowest tolerance for ambiguity, and also we have a lot of lower level learners. So having improved forms of comprehension is really, really important for a language learning environment. Lastly, if there's clear dialogue and clear movement in class, that is to say, one person speaking at a time, one person speaking a specific sentence at a time, and using movement intentionally to highlight what we're doing in front of this webcam, we can achieve more intentional forms of practice, which obviously might yield better results, greater focus, easier to follow, improved comprehension, more intentional. This can give a rise to much more efficient forms of learning. The question is how might we put this into practice? What could we do exactly as teachers to really make this happen? Because as I said, a lot of teachers have taught online and have not necessarily experienced states of flow with their learners. It's been challenging for technical reasons. It's been challenging for group management reasons. Perhaps the types of tools or the techniques or the medium itself poses a challenge. How can we capitalize on everything that I've mentioned here before and use that in our online learning environment? And there are 4 main steps. Number 1, target 100% visual communication. That is to say, gesticulating and talking, it's not necessarily visual communication. However, having specific gestures such as asking people to speak, asking people to focus on pronunciation, having photos which clearly show what is being said. Also having barometers of progress, that is to say, check marks, tick marks, corrections, feedback. All of this is visual forms of communication. And really what we should do in an online learning space is target 100%. That is to say, every new piece of information that we're including has to have a visual correspondent. Why? Because if we can, that's what learners see. And that's almost the only thing that learners see. So it will draw in their focus and make comprehension much easier. Also, make sure to systematize deliberate practice. Very often, I see trainers that might have multiple questions, multiple answers, multiple words of vocabulary, and it's not clear who speaks when. This is very tricky to manage in an online learning environment. And that's why it's important to systematize deliberate practice, having very clear questions, answers, and vocabulary words that are to be used in those answers, and then clarifying who's asking and who's answering at any one time in an exercise or an activity. Systematizing this as well so that learners can understand there's perhaps a rotation. As only one person can speak at one time, there's a rotation that's happening. That perhaps it's the teacher that's interacting with the students or the students that are interacting between themselves. In any case, it needs to be systematized. It needs to be more clear. And when I say deliberate practice, it also needs to be focused above all on oral expression. This is the most effortful, most challenging aspect of language learning. Also, make sure to clarify and simplify instructions. Because context is reduced, because the webcam has the limitations it does, it's really important to use a lot of gestures and very clear verbal cues. That is to say, if we want someone to ask a question and another person to ask, we might do it as such. Robert, question for John. And in doing so, Robert is very clear that he's asking a question, and John is very clear that he will be the person who's answering it. Now, this might seem deceptively simple, but it actually can clear up a whole lot of confusion in online learning. Also, it's really important to move intentionally. Very often, I see teachers online that don't seem to understand the importance of very simple gestures, such as asking learners for an answer, or asking learners to speak, to focus on pronunciation, or TPR, which is total physical response, associating specific gestures with words or images. Moving intentionally is really important because, as we've seen, every single movement is highlighted in online learning and becomes more and more important. So these 4 steps will help produce much more efficient forms of online learning, and hopefully will generate this form of flow. Now, let's see how we might put this into practice, because obviously that sounds good, but it'd be great to have a concrete example. Here's our first example. It's with an A1 level kids group. It is on the theme of landscapes, or travel, if you will. And the goal is with these 4 images here, is to get learners to play a guessing game between myself, the teacher, and them, in which they will ask me where I am and try to discern if I'm in a specific location or another. And obviously the goal is to find out where I am. So how might we put this into practice using 100% visual forms of communication, systematized deliberate practice, clear instructions, and intentional forms of movement? Let's do it right now. So I might start off by saying, where are you? And asking the class to repeat this general main opening question. And then I might say to my learners, raise your hand to ask me a question. And the first person I see raising their hand, I will call on them. I will say, okay, John, question for you. Clear instruction. John might say something like beach. And in this case, obviously, because we want a full sentence, I might say something like, are you at the beach? Getting him to repeat the full sentence out loud, which I might answer, no, I'm not. Getting the group to repeat the answer, systematizing deliberate practice. Then I might say, where are you? Get the group to repeat it again, the target question, and raise your hand to ask the question. Once again, another learner, Jane, might answer, and she might say something like desert, whereupon I might say, are you at the desert? getting the entire group to repeat the question. No, I'm not, repeating the answer. And sooner or later, we would find out that I'm in the city. And I would congratulate them for having found the correct response. As you can see right here, we have 100% forms of visual communication. We have X marks, checks, confetti that are clearly indicating where we're heading with intentional forms of movement, systematized deliberate practice, question, answer, repeating as a group, specific speakers, it's each time. Also simplified instructions, very, very clear, very simple. And lastly, intentional forms of movement. We could also do TPR, total physical response, to explore each location with gestures. Let's see how this might play out with the teens group. So here's another example, an A2 level teens group practicing both regular and irregular forms of the present simple. The theme is, what did you do last weekend? And as you can see here, we've got 6 different images with both regular and irregular verbs in the past tense, and a couple of different questions, practicing negation as well as affirmative forms of replies. Here, I might ask a specific learner, I might say, John, question for Sue. John might ask Sue the question, Sue, did you sleep last weekend? And Sue might say, yes, I slept last weekend. Whereby I might say, hey, great response, I slept. There I can indicate the correct form of the past tense, as well as a check mark. We're done. We're creating a visual barometer of progress. Then I might say, Sue, question for Sarah. Sarah, did you play sports last weekend? Yes, I played sports last weekend. As such, we could practice all of the different verbs here, both irregular and regular forms in the past tense, with 100% visual instruction, systematized deliberate practice with one person asking the question, one person answering the question, as well as clarified, simplified gestures, instructions. In terms of intentional forms of movement, as you might have seen, teens can be somewhat reluctant to do that. It might seem too childish at times. However, having clear forms of movement as a teacher is really important to indicate who might be speaking, who might be repeating. As such, these 2 examples show you how to put into practice these 4 easy steps on how to cultivate greater levels of focus and more intense forms of deliberate practice. And hopefully that gives you a concrete idea of how you might put this into practice in your own teaching online. But obviously the idea is also to share ideas, because now that you've seen this, now that you've digested this information, you might be able to share some of the activities that you've done in online learning. And you also might have specific questions for myself on anything that we've seen here. And I'd be more than happy to open up the floor now. Evrim says, less is more approach while planning content for online lessons, and planning is what needs to be done. Both pre and post online classes are helpful. Using a set of responses and using them consistently and minimizing teacher talk improves the flow of lessons. I really like the second half of this answer, because indeed, a set of responses, using them consistently, that is systematized forms of deliberate practice. Planning content is what, indeed, less is more. I think that if we, above all, focus on visual forms of learning, we actually don't need a whole lot on our slides. Simple images, simple text, as we've seen with these examples, can get us very far. Emmanuel says, 2 questions. Is there any research about long-term retention from online learning? My experience is that I can get through lessons online and students can show learning and understanding in the short term. However, I find that when I refer to a lesson from a few months earlier, retention is low. Any thoughts? Yes, many thoughts. If you look at in-person learning as well, unfortunately, retention can be an issue. One of the biggest solutions is visual learning. For some reason, the amount that we are able to remember as human beings is very much proportionate to whether we've seen it and whether we've done it. So experiential and visual learning. That's why it's important using gestures and images. I would say the same issue can come up in in-person teaching. How do we improve retention? Use more images, use more gestures, but above all, a third thing is associated with positive emotions. That's why gamifying is really important with kids and teens. Positive emotions, images that move, us moving. There's something about it that helps us hold on to concepts. There have been some interesting experiments that you can do even yourself in terms of memorizing concepts using all three of those techniques that are rather powerful. Do I have statistics? I would be really curious about long-term retention. In any case, what I've seen in our learners is, like I said in the very beginning, very impressive amounts of progression with online learning. That is to say, language acquisition. A1 learners going up to A2 to B1 levels in shorter periods of time. That is what I have noticed under the right conditions that has happened. The second part of your question, why do you say that younger learners are least comfortable with ambiguity? That's not my experience teaching both younger learners and adults. What I mean by this is ambiguity. If a concept is not clear, if something is not explained 100% clearly, if they don't understand what's happening, if it's ambiguous, their tolerance is very low. That is to say, adults might try. We've trained ourselves to focus on things and to really search for responses. Generally, younger learners don't have that patience. That's what I mean in terms of a tolerance for ambiguity. If we're referring to a tolerance for ambiguity in terms of moral issues, that's something else. What I'm really focusing here in is their tolerance for ambiguity in comprehension. Valerie says, which program do you use to add pictures to your teaching sessions? There are several ones that are very good. I'm a fan of Canva because it's free. It's a good tool for educators. PowerPoint, everyone knows. But I think Canva is really good. Elisa Veta says, should we insist to use their camera to follow them more efficiently? This is a really good question because sometimes learners feel that using a webcam isn't always useful. Why do I have to turn it on? This has been a very common experience with teens. I would argue that if we're doing deliberate forms of practice, systematized deliberate forms of practice, that we need to see people. Because we need to see them speaking. We actually need to see if they're doing it. Us as human beings, if we just hear a voice, there's less of a sense of presence. And that's what we really should be doing here, is cultivating presence online. If we hear people interacting, that's a form of presence. It's even better if we can physically see them and we can see that they're doing something. So I would say, should we insist? Yes, I would recommend it if possible. Nadine says, in your experience, does this approach also work for kids and teens who prefer a more kinesthetic, tactile learning style? Yes, I would get on to the fact as well that in online lessons, it's also nice to include activities that do feature tactile elements. For example, I showed an example of a young man presenting something. I think that's one of the simplest ways to get kids and teens to do this is a Pictionary, is hold a piece of paper, get a pen, and draw it for us. This can be done on a physical simulacrum of a whiteboard. It can also be done on the online whiteboard. It is tactile in the sense that I'm touching it, I'm doing it. I think it's nice for younger learners to hold something in their hands. So doing it on a physical piece of paper, making things and then using them. A very simple example is a cootie catcher. It's a wonderful opportunity for students to interact. It is 100% tactile. Drawing, presenting, those are also forms of tactile activities that can work just as well online. You do need to give space and time for them and have very clear instructions, but they can be applicable. Audrey says, what about a very quiet group? Like those groups who just do not contribute. In the classroom, at least eye contact is there and you can play a game a bit. But online, especially with teens, they'll hide behind the camera and not feel the need to contribute. Here, I would say, Audrey, what's going to be really important is using a lot of group repetition. Because indeed, speaking a foreign language in a foreign environment online with a new teacher can be daunting. Moreover, teens, as we've seen, there's a lot of social anxiety about speaking up, potentially making mistakes. Group repetition, I found, is a really nice way to overcome this fear of speaking. That is to say, saying something yourself and asking for the group to repeat, as I did in the kids' example. This can also be done for teens and in the guise of working on pronunciation, for example, practicing minimal pairs as a class, but even simple questions and answers, practicing past tense forms, the different pronunciations that come with ed verbs, depending on where consonants fall within the verb. This can be very, very useful. And I find that once we get in the habit of speaking becomes easier. But sometimes also the fact that we're repeating it as a group doesn't mean that learners don't feel singled out. They don't feel that they're the only one speaking if the entire group is repeating. Can this be done effectively and efficiently online? Yes. In my experience, yes. So I would highly recommend using group repetition. Also, the second thing is it is a very common remedy to shy groups are good icebreakers. I would always make sure to start off with a couple of really clear icebreakers in a lesson. Very often teachers go straight into content, which is even more daunting because we're learning something new with a new group and a new language. It can be very overwhelming. So starting off with a clear icebreaker warm-up phase, a good 5 to 10 minutes of rituals. So activities that we do on a regular basis that learners find easy, develop confidence, boost their confidence. Number 2, icebreakers by which I have to speak quickly, find the result to something, and say it out loud, such as a game. There are many good games out there, but one of my favorites is Backs to the Board. That is to say, where a word is shown to a group who has to explain it to a learner who has to find the answer. This is a common icebreaker. There are many others. And then as well, to top off the warm-up phase, I would use revision of previously seen material. Once again, this is a confidence booster. He or she who says more confidence generally implies more fluency. So starting off with a really solid warm-up is really important, and then using a lot of group repetition. Those two elements, I believe, Audrey, can really help with shy groups. Anna says, yes, I'm very interested in this classroom, in the classroom management aspect of this. Yes, classroom management. This is a good point. So a point I wanted to get to, because it's one of the most important things that comes up with kids and teens, is how do I effectively manage attention in classroom? Make sure that number 1, I can get that attention. Number 2, I can hold on to it throughout the duration of the lesson. What's important to note is that our tolerance for learning online is a little bit, in terms of the duration, is a little bit shortened as compared to in person. Why? There's screen fatigue. So I would shoot for really short, snappy activities. I would say a duration of maybe 20 minutes maximum per activity. I would keep it short. And above all, include a lot of micro variations. That is to say, one main activity and slight changes on that activity. For example, to go back to the example with the teens, practicing simple past tense verbs on the subject of what did you do last weekend, a micro variation would be, well, the main variation is we're doing it as a group. The micro variation might be now the teens are asking me the questions, or I'm asking the teens the questions, or we break off into breakout rooms, and then they're asking each other the individual questions, and then we switch the groups. These are all small variations which will help learners stay engaged with the task at hand, because our brains crave novelty. If we can give learners new ideas, new experiences, they'll generally stay more attentive than if it's just the same thing every single time. It gets boring. So important, quick, snappy activities with micro variations. In terms of class management, online learning environment has a very unique capacity, which is to say microphone muting. So in periods where it's really important that learners be focused in on one thing, for example, watching a video clip where it's imperative that they hear the sound, we can mute everyone's microphone and ask them to listen into the dialogue, to note down specific concepts, to note down new ideas, words they don't know, and then unmute. This is a really helpful function as well if we want 2 or 3 or a small group of learners specifically to interact. We can mute the rest of the class and focus in on that individual group. It's not a function I would focus in on. It's not the only feature I would use in class, but it is very useful. And it is unique to an online learning environment. Staying busy with a group of kids, rather keeping them busy through group repetition, is really important. As I said, repeating a main sentence out, having them repeat. Also, systematizing deliberate practice will all help learners be more concentrated. Why? Because they are continually interacting with either between themselves or the teacher. So all of these steps hopefully can help classroom management in an online learning environment. Do you think these techniques are also useful for other subjects? I'm teaching STEM subjects. So let's review the four main points that I stressed. Number one, 100% visual learning. STEM involves many images, formulas, calculations, precise steps that need to be explained with a great deal of precision. Is that a useful technique then? 100% visual learning? Yes. Number two, systematized deliberate practice. The deliberate practice necessary for STEM is very different, however, whereas in online language learning, language acquisition, we're focusing more on oral production. In STEM, it's very often written, the production, right? We're trying to calculate something. We're trying to figure out the squares, the area of a surface or a plane. We're completing equations. That's a different form of deliberate practice. Can that be done online? Yes, it can be systematized. In fact, there are very interesting applications with online whiteboards where you can have multiple learners working on the whiteboard at the same time. It means that peer feedback and sharing becomes much easier. The third technique, which I said by which I said clear, simplified instructions, is that applicable to the STEM? Absolutely. And I think it becomes more important in an online environment, especially if the information that's being communicated is complex. And then last point was intentional forms of movement. STEM usually, although it's a field where there's been less use of movement, TPR has been applied to a lot of STEM environments, and with great effect. There are several sites such as GoNoodle, which feature TPR for virtual learning environments on a lot of different STEM subjects for different levels, different ages. So does that work? Yes, absolutely. I would do more research to find out how. Valerie says, I find some students are so scared to express themselves, they refuse to communicate for fear of appearing stupid. How can we improve students' confidence? Valerie, I would go back here to, I believe we had a question from Audrey, if I'm not mistaken, about a quiet group. I would say focusing on the same things that for them might be really important. That is to say, a really solid warm-up phase, a lot of use of group repetition, and to get students to speak a little bit more. Both of those things are really important to overcome the fear of speaking. I think also taking the drama out of speaking is important. De-dramatizing speaking, that is to say, taking away the fear of mistakes by encouraging students to make mistakes. Not intentionally, obviously. We want them to be targeting precision. However, very often just letting a group know that making mistakes is not only an okay, but a very important thing to do in learning, can really help them. But I would, above all, also encourage them use a lot of group repetition and a really solid warm-up every single time. Sadet says, what is the best group number? My apologies if answered earlier. I would recommend for an online learning environment, a smaller group than for in-person. Ideally, in my opinion, I would say between 4 to 6 learners. I would really target that. Obviously, we can go down to 2 or 3 learners, but there the opportunities for interaction are just reduced. Up to 6 learners, I think, is reasonably comfortable in terms of group management. We can go higher than that, but I don't think it's necessarily the best. Getting learners to collaborate in breakout rooms, asking them to create content with visuals is very helpful. Creating visual videos, presentations, etc., seems to be a more motivating experience in the online space, the role of the teacher can be visiting the rooms to attend to questions and guiding accordingly. I really like that. That's absolutely right. That's really what I'm trying to harp on here, is that because this is an inherently visual space, all of our peripheral vision is cut out, and we're focusing on this 2D space that's just about that big. That's all we can really learn from. So it needs to be more visual.